The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. The Pharisees went off and plotted how they might entrap Jesus in speech. They sent their disciples to him with the Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are a truthful man, and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. And you are not concerned with anyone's opinion, for you do not regard a person's status. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it lawful to pay the census tax to Caesar or not?" Knowing their malice, Jesus said, "Why are you testing me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin that pays the census tax." Then they handed him the Roman coin. He said to them, "Whose image is this and whose inscription?" They replied, "Caesar's." At that he said to them, "Then repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." The Gospel of the Lord. I'd like to share with you two little stories. The first one falls under the category of rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's. First of all, you all know how important it is to vote. We've heard that since we were little kids. You know, voting is not only a right that we have, but it's certainly a privilege as American citizens. But just when you find yourself not wanting to go to the polls on election day, just remember your one vote could make a huge difference. Let's look at some historical examples. One vote gave Oliver Cromwell control of all of England in the year 1645. One vote in the Parliament caused King Charles I of England to be executed in 1649. Had it not been for one vote in 1776, the official language in the United States would have been, anyone? German. Was ist los? Can you imagine if we'd all be speaking German today? One vote kept Aaron Burr, later charged with treason, from becoming president in 1800. Had it not been for one vote in 1845, the state of Texas would not have become a part of the United States. Can you imagine the map without Texas? That's like half of the country. One vote saved President Andrew Johnson from impeachment in 1868. One vote admitted California, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho into the Union. One vote changed the entire nation of France from a monarchy to a republic in 1875. One vote elected Rutherford B. Hayes to the presidency, and the man in the Electoral College who cast that vote was an Indiana representative also who had been elected by one vote in 1876. And this is where it gets very scary. It was by one vote that in 1923, Adolf Hitler became the leader of the Nazi Party, an event which later resulted in the slaughter of 6 million Jews, let alone another 2 million Gypsies, Italians, and so on. Had it not been for one vote, World War II, with all its pain and death, might have never taken place. And then finally, one vote by Al Gore in 1993 approved the largest tax increase in United States history. Think about that before you decide about global warming. Now, rendering unto God. Mr. Cleveland Stroud had coached the basketball team, the Blue Collar Bulldogs of Rockdale County High School in Conyers, Georgia, for 18 years before his team made it to the state championship. Stroud recalls it was the perfect night when they won, a night you dream of. He was carried around the gym on the shoulders of his triumphant players and their proud parents. The local paper even put his picture on the front page. But the excitement was short-lived. 2 months after the championship, during a routine grade check, Stroud discovered that one player had been academically ineligible at the time. The player had only played 45 seconds during the regional qualifying tournament, and he wasn't a very important player to begin with. Stroud says, "I thought it was all ruined. I went through a phase where I was really depressed." He struggled with what to do next, yet his commitment to integrity led him to the right decision. "Winning is the most important thing for any coach," he says, "but your principles have to be higher than your goals." He reported the error to the league, and the Bulldogs forfeited their trophy. When the team lamented their loss in the locker room, some of the players even crying, he told them, "You've got to do what is honest, what is right, and what the rules say. That's how we pay to God what's His. People forget the scores of basketball games, but they don't ever forget what you're made of." So I mentioned at the beginning of Mass, today's gospel has been many times quoted throughout history, and I'm sure when you're getting ready to write your quarterly tax check, you probably think of this scripture yourself. Today's gospel comes from Matthew chapter 22, but it's also found in Mark 12 and Luke chapter 20. But what's interesting in this passage, as Matthew gives it to us, is that whereas the past month of Sundays we've heard Jesus hammer at the Jewish leadership, known as the chief elders and chief priests of the people, the aristocracy, the most respected people in society, now they come back at him and they are on the offensive. And they're not very pretty as they do it. As the story opens up, Matthew tells us the Pharisees, that's that party of the Jews at the time of Jesus that sought to purify the Jewish faith, and their thinking was the way you do that is to obey every commandment you can get your fingers on. You obey them all, you get your ticket punched to heaven someday. So these Pharisees are sending some of their disciples and a group that will only be mentioned once here in this gospel, the Herodians, to entrap Jesus, we are told. Who are these Herodians? The Herodians were people who were loyal to King Herod the Great. King Herod the Great was a puppet king of the people of Israel at the time of Jesus. And the way he got to power was that Caesar put him in power. Caesar's thinking was, if I can find a Jew who can govern their own people, then it will save me in terms of troops and expenses of supporting those troops. It was a clever move. And Herod was ruthless. He killed a couple of his own brothers because he was so paranoid he thought they were going to try to assassinate him. So brother, blood, it didn't matter for Herod. He'd kill you in a heartbeat if you challenged his authority. Well, anyway, these people come to Jesus, and as Matthew says, they want to entrap him. It's interesting, the Greek word behind this word entrap comes from the field of hunting, actually, in Greek culture. And the way the Greeks did it a lot of times back then, when they'd go out in the fields to hunt wild game for food, they would entrap an animal. They'd corner an animal either in a cave or maybe in an area surrounded by rocks, and then a couple of men would throw a net over the animal. The whole idea was to do something like a spider web, so the animal trying to free itself would get entangled in the net so tightly that it was easy to move and then remove and kill for your dinner. And so they're coming at Jesus with bad intent. And notice how they begin addressing him. First of all, they call him teacher. And as pleasant as that may sound, that's not a good title, you see. Because in Matthew's gospel, and the same can be said for John's gospel, anybody who calls Jesus teacher is a non-disciple and usually is antagonistic towards Jesus. And notice what they say. They're not being polite to Jesus, they're being very sarcastic. They say, "Teacher, we know you are a good man, that you tell the truth, that you don't court any human being's favor, you don't show any deference towards any particular group or idea or political system. We have a question for you, good teacher. Is it lawful to pay the tax to Caesar or not?" Now, it appears that the Lord has got a real quandary on his hands. Because if he says to this group, "Yeah, go ahead and pay taxes to Caesar," then they would accuse him of being disloyal to God, to being unfaithful to the way of Moses as well. And so he was impious, would have been the accusation, rather than a holy man. On the other hand, if he said, "Do not pay taxes to Caesar," then the Herodians, for sure, who were loyal to Rome, would have accused him of treason. They would have filed a complaint with the procurator, who would have ordered Herod to send troops to arrest Jesus, and the penalty was immediate execution. So it appears that Jesus is in a quandary. But look what the Lord does. He calmly looks at them and he says, "Does anybody have one of those Roman coins that you give Caesar for taxes?" And they immediately pull out a Roman denarii. A Roman denarii is a small silver coin, not worth a whole lot. But what was interesting about the denarii is that it had the face of Caesar on it. Because you see, Caesar considered himself to be a god, and so did the Romans consider him to be a god. But here's the problem. In the Ten Commandments, and particularly the first commandment from Exodus 20, it is written, "You shall not put other gods before me. You shall not have images of other gods in your possession." So in other words, look what the Lord cleverly did. He asked them for a forbidden coin that the Jews were not supposed to have in their possession if they were going to be pious and holy to begin with. And the question is, what are you doing with one of these coins in your pocket, you hypocrite? Why do you have one to begin with? Well, the Lord spares them the embarrassment, but what he says to them instead is absolutely profound. Whose inscription is on it? They reply, "Caesar." And he says, "Well, if that belongs to Caesar, give what belongs to Caesar. It's his. But give to God what belongs to God." And off they go. And they're not done yet. We got a couple more weeks of their offensive towards Jesus. So what's the point of this passage for us? We are called as Catholics in the United States to give to Caesar. There's no doubt about it. And believe me, 4 times a year when I write my quarterly tax check, I give painfully to Caesar. But you know what? Catholics historically have always been good and faithful citizens. Look at the history of the Catholic Church in the United States. It's a fascinating read. And what you will find is that Catholics have been at the forefront of everything that's good that's happened in this country. And from where did most of the Catholics who are in this country come? Well, historically, 2 groups came to this country. One at the turn of the 19th century and one at the turn of the 20th century. The majority of them were from Western Europe. They were all Catholic. They came to this country with one little problem to contend with. The country didn't want them. The country was xenophobic. It was afraid of them damn foreigners, you see. And so when it came to, let's say, education, the public school system, which was really just emerging, did not want these immigrant kids in their schools. And so these families ended up settling in the major cities on the East Coast, all the way from Boston in the north to Savannah, Georgia in the south. And look what happened. The nuns, the brothers, the priests painstakingly taught them how to read and write. They taught them how to carry out personal hygiene characteristics. They taught them how to count money, And yes, they encouraged them to vote. And they did. And look what happened. In 100 years, this group of ghetto immigrants that came to this country, illiterate and uneducated, has become today the largest income-producing subgroup in the country. Catholics make more money as a religious group than any other denomination in this country. Pretty amazing. Now, I'm not going to tell you how we rank according to studies in terms of our giving, but we'll let that go. An amazing thing. How many Catholic soldiers shed their blood on the battlefield during the great wars in this nation? And we could go on and on. Are you aware of the fact that Chief Justice John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, is a daily mass attender, for goodness sake? And Justice Anthony Scalia, he has twin sons, both of whom are Catholic priests in the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia. Can't get much more Catholic than that. But Catholics have always been good citizens. And so that opening story about voting is not a luxury for us. We are called to vote. We are called to be good citizens. We are called to support the laws of the land. And Catholics as a group have always stood up for Caesar and taking care of Caesar. And Caesar has been good to God and to God's people. We do have in this country, like many of our brothers and sisters in Iraq and Pakistan and Afghanistan, we have freedom to practice our religion or freedom not to practice our religion if we choose to do so. That's a privilege granted in our country, and how wonderful it is. But the one thing you need to be careful about and pay attention to is that sometimes Caesar likes to flex his muscles a little bit. Sometimes Caesar likes to overreach into God's territory, into God's turf. And it's going on right now. Just recently, there was a case that was argued in front of the United States Supreme Court. The case was brought forward by the Solicitor General's office, which is the legal branch which represents the White House. They brought out the case on behalf of a woman who is a Lutheran minister and was terminated. She alleged that she was terminated wrongfully. And so what the government was doing was trying to argue based on a concept known as a ministerial exception. What that basically says, in light of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, that not only are we free to practice our religion, but the government, Caesar, cannot infringe on certain traditions and doctrines that we have as a denomination, especially those that have been born out in history. They didn't just come out of the sky yesterday. And so it appears that this woman that was terminated is alleging something having to do with discrimination. It wasn't clear from the article I read what type of discrimination. But nonetheless, in the course of her oral argument, Chief Justice John Roberts approached her and he said to her, well, you know what? You centered this case on the ministerial exception, the fact that churches and denominations are free to practice their doctrines. But what would you argue if you come before our court on a case of gender discrimination involving the Catholic Church's doctrine to ordain only male priests? What do you have to say about that? And in so many words, I'll save you the legal jargon, she basically said that that's apples and oranges compared to what I'm arguing, Your Honor. But then Justice Breyer came right at her and said, so what are you saying to me here? Are you going to challenge the Catholic Church's doctrine on a male-only priesthood? And she went on to say something very abstract. She said, the government's interests are in no time superseding the First Amendment at this time. Or in other words, she put the government's interest on par with the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, as though they are two eggs in the same carton of a dozen of eggs. What about the primacy of the First Amendment? Should that not have preference always over the government interest? Or in other words, my friends, bottom line, she's opening up the door that should a gender discrimination suit be filed by a woman who wants to become a Catholic priest and refused to do so, she opened the door up for that case to be heard by the United States Supreme Court. Caesar reaching over to God's turf. Another one that's been in the news a lot the past couple of years, thanks to Catherine Sebelius, who claims to be a baptized Catholic. She is radically pro-abortion, believe me. And she happens to be the head of the Department of Health and Human Services. What's her beef? Well, when President Bush, in his last term of office, put forth, in light of the law of the land, which is abortion on demand, what was called a conscience clause. And what that basically said was this: no hospital, no healthcare institution can require its medical personnel to have you do a procedure, whether it be abortion, sterilization, whatever the case may be, if it violates your freedom of religion and your moral principles. Guess what? Sebelius has been trying to challenge that time and time again for the past 2 years. She wants to rescind the conscience clause. Well, what kind of position does that put our Catholic doctors in, you see, or our Catholic nurses, or anybody who believes in respecting the gift of human life? Why is the government reaching over into God's turf again? I was involved in a situation up in Wheeling, a big legal battle. It was ugly, it really was. And I was on the hot seat because I had the largest Catholic church in the city of Wheeling. And here's what was going on. For a number of years, the city of Wheeling had been struggling financially, and they started charging the churches, or assessing the churches, what was known as a fire service fee to help fund the fire department, allegedly. The problem is, the guy that I replaced at that parish when I went up there, who had been the pastor before me, was Father Schmidt, who would go on to become Bishop Schmidt. And one of the things I learned was Bishop Schmidt, in all his years at that parish, never paid the fire service fee because in his thinking it was a tax. He said, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, and swims like a duck, then it's a duck. This is a tax. It ain't a fee. And so, guess what? We went to court. And I felt like the eyes of the whole Upper Ohio Valley was watching me. Because what was I going to do? Some of the other churches had buckled and gone ahead and paid the fee. Our attorneys argued in court, and I thought quite convincingly, that it was not a fee. It was a thinly disguised tax. And if you impose a tax in this area, what other areas will you begin taxing the church? Well, unfortunately, we lost. The fee was imposed upon us. But then I had another problem to deal with. We had about $20,000 of back fees that had never been paid. Fortunately, Caesar was merciful to Father Jim, and they forgave our past unpaid fees, so we just started out at ground one. But my point is, do you see how Caesar can reach over into God's turf? Now, if Caesar was smart, he would do whatever he could do to support the church. Why? And I'm not talking about establishing a theocracy in this country. The last thing we want is an Iran in this country. No, but if they were smart, they would do all they could to support the work of the church. The largest charitable organization on planet Earth is not the Red Cross. It's Catholic Charities. Catholic Charities. We give more and do more for the poor than any other organization on the planet. Think of the number of kids, Catholic schools, especially in the inner city, educate and educate well to become leaders in our country. The same thing's happening here at Fatima. No, if Caesar was smart, he doesn't have to be in love with God, but at least he could not get in God's way and allow God to do what God does, and that is save people. But with regard to giving to God, that must be our first priority. And this, my friends, is what we call stewardship. Putting God first above all things. So let us pray today that we may take the Lord's words to heart. We are called to be good citizens, and we need to pray for the grace to do that to the best that we can. But we always are called to be disciples first. And that means putting God first and at the center of everything.